The security camera footage timestamp read 2:47 a.m. when Vera Kravtsova's hand reached for the kitchen knife. What happened in the next 11 minutes would transform a respected Moscow psychologist into one of Russia's most controversial figures. But the question that would haunt investigators for years wasn't about what she did that night. It was about why she smiled while doing it. The blade caught the fluorescent light as she turned toward the bedroom where her husband Dmitri lay sleeping. And in that moment, everything that had been building beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage was about to explode in ways no one could have predicted. But to understand the depths of what occurred that February night, you have to go back 6 years earlier. To the day Vera first walked into Dmitri's life and set in motion a series of events that would captivate an entire nation. Vera Nikolaevna Kravtsova was 32 years old when she met Dmitri Volkov at a medical conference in St. Petersburg. She had built her reputation as a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma therapy, and her research on dissociative disorders had earned her recognition throughout Eastern Europe. Colleagues described her as brilliant but distant, the kind of woman who could read people with unsettling accuracy, yet kept her own emotions locked behind an impenetrable wall. Dmitri, 41 at the time, was a successful pharmaceutical executive whose charm and confidence filled every room he entered. Their connection was immediate and intense, the kind of attraction that feels fated. And within 8 months, they were married in a lavish ceremony that Moscow's elite still remembered years later. Friends and family spoke of their chemistry, the way Dmitri would look at Vera as if she were the only person in the world, the way Vera seemed to soften around him in ways no one had seen before. But what no one knew was that from the very beginning, Vera had been keeping a journal, and the entries she wrote in those early days revealed a woman who was documenting something far more calculated than love. Was their entire relationship built on a foundation of deception? Or did something change along the way that transformed devotion into something darker? The first 2 years of their marriage appeared flawless from the outside. Dmitri's career flourished as he climbed to a senior vice president position at Novamed Pharmaceuticals, overseeing the distribution of medications throughout Russia and former Soviet states. Vera continued her practice, working primarily with women who had survived domestic violence and childhood trauma. They purchased a spacious apartment in the prestigious Arbat district, decorated with modern art and expensive furniture that reflected their combined success. They attended gallery openings and charity galas, took vacations to the Greek islands and the French Riviera, and posted carefully curated photos on social media that showed two beautiful people living a beautiful life. But behind closed doors, tensions were beginning to surface. Dmitri's work demands increased, keeping him at the office until late hours. And Vera noticed discrepancies in his stories about where he had been and who he had been with. She started paying attention to the little things, the way he tilted his phone away when texting, the unexplained charges on credit card statements, the faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers on his shirts. When she confronted him about her suspicions, Dmitri became defensive and turned the accusations back on her, suggesting that her psychology training made her paranoid and that she was projecting her clients' traumas onto their relationship. The gaslighting was subtle at first, but it planted seeds of doubt in Vera's mind about her own perceptions. Or did it? What if Vera wasn't doubting herself at all, but instead was gathering evidence for something she had been planning all along? The turning point came in year 3 of their marriage, when Vera discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been joyous, but Dmitri's reaction was measured and lukewarm. He spoke about the timing being difficult with his career trajectory, about the financial implications despite their wealth, about how they should wait before making such a major decision. Vera felt something break inside her during that conversation, but she kept her expression neutral, her psychologist's mask firmly in place. She agreed they would discuss it further, but 2 weeks later she miscarried naturally before any decision needed to be made. Dmitri's relief was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind appropriate words of comfort. Vera spent 3 days in bed after the miscarriage, and during those 72 hours, something fundamental shifted in her. When she emerged, she seemed different to those who knew her well, quieter, more watchful, as if she were observing her own life from a distance. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, taking on more clients and extending her hours. But she also began doing something else, something no one knew about until much later. She started recording conversations with Dmitri, setting up small cameras in their home, documenting every interaction, every argument, every moment of their deteriorating marriage. If anyone had discovered what she was doing, they would have called it an invasion of privacy, evidence of obsession. But Vera would later claim she was protecting herself, gathering proof of something she needed the world to see. But proof of what exactly? By the 4th year, Dmitri's affairs were no longer just suspicions. Vera had names, dates, locations, and photographs. She knew about Marina, the 26-year-old marketing coordinator at his company who he took to hotels on Tuesday afternoons. She knew about Olga, the personal trainer he met 3 mornings a week for sessions that had nothing to do with exercise. She knew about the others, too. Women whose faces she memorized from the images captured on her hidden cameras when Dmitri brought them to their home during the hours he thought Vera was at work. The depth of his betrayal should have shattered her, and perhaps it did, but not in the ways people might expect. Vera didn't cry or rage or make dramatic confrontations. Instead, she became colder, more methodical. She scheduled extra therapy sessions for herself, seeing a colleague who specialized in narcissistic abuse and trauma bonding. She told her therapist about the affairs, about the emotional manipulation, about how Dmitri had isolated her from her family by creating conflicts and misunderstandings until her relationships with them became strained. Her therapist suggested she consider leaving the marriage, that staying was damaging her mental health. Vera nodded and said she was thinking about it, but in her private journals, she was writing something entirely different. She was writing about justice, about exposure, about making Dmitri face consequences for the first time in his privileged life. The question is, at what point did thoughts of justice transform into plans for something far more sinister? The 5th year brought new complications. Dmitri's company became embroiled in a scandal involving the distribution of counterfeit medications, and while he claimed no personal involvement, Vera discovered evidence suggesting otherwise. She found emails on his laptop discussing shipment alterations and profit margins, correspondence with individuals known to have connections to organized crime, bank transfers to offshore accounts that didn't match his declared income. She copied everything, storing it on encrypted drives that she hid in locations he would never think to look. When federal investigators began looking into Novamed Pharmaceuticals, Vera considered coming forward with what she knew, but something stopped her. She realized that the information she had was more valuable as leverage, as insurance for what might come next. Meanwhile, their marriage had become a cold war fought with silent treatments and passive aggression. They barely spoke except when necessary, and when they did, every conversation was laden with unspoken resentments. Dmitri began staying away from home more frequently, sometimes disappearing for entire weekends with vague explanations about business trips. Vera didn't question these absences. In fact, she seemed relieved by them. She used the time alone to consolidate her evidence, to organize the hundreds of hours of recordings and thousands of photographs she had collected. She was building a case, though whether it was for divorce proceedings or something else remained unclear even to her. But one thing was certain. She was preparing for an endgame. The breaking point arrived on February 10th, 6 years into their marriage. Dmitri came home drunk at 1:30 in the morning, reeking of alcohol and another woman's perfume. Vera was awake, sitting in the darkened living room, waiting. When he stumbled through the door, she turned on the lights and told him she wanted a divorce. His response was immediate and violent, not physically but psychologically. He laughed at her, a cruel sound that filled the apartment with contempt. He told her she had nothing without him, that her career had stagnated while his had soared, that no one would believe anything she said about him because he had been careful to craft a public image of being a devoted husband saddled with a mentally unstable wife. He revealed that he had been documenting what he called her erratic behavior, that he had emails to her colleagues expressing concern about her mental state, that he had positioned himself as the victim of her psychological problems. The gaslighting that had been subtle for years was now fully weaponized. He told her that if she tried to leave, he would destroy her professionally, that he would ensure no one in the medical community would take her seriously again. He said he had connections, power, and money that she couldn't match. And then he said the words that would echo through the trial that would come later. "You're nothing, Vera. You've always been nothing. And if you think you can hurt me, you're even crazier than I've been telling people you are." What Dmitri didn't know was that Vera had recorded every word of that conversation, but more importantly, something inside her had finally snapped in ways that couldn't be repaired. The next 2 weeks were a strange calm before the storm. Vera continued seeing her clients, maintaining her professional facade with remarkable composure. She went through the motions of daily life, but people who knew her later said there was something different about her, an eerie tranquility that seemed disconnected from reality. She stopped eating regularly, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, and lost noticeable weight. Her sister Elena tried calling multiple times, sensing something was wrong, but Vera didn't answer. Dmitri, emboldened by what he perceived as his victory in breaking Vera's spirit, became more brazen. He brought women to their apartment openly now, not even bothering to hide it. He taunted Vera with his infidelities, leaving evidence deliberately where she would find it. Lingerie that wasn't hers in the laundry, receipts from romantic dinners, explicit text messages left open on his phone. He seemed to be testing how far he could push her, enjoying the psychological torture. What he failed to recognize was that Vera had stopped feeling the pain of his betrayals because she had moved beyond emotion into something else entirely. During those 2 weeks, she made meticulous preparations. She organized all her evidence into files, creating copies and distributing them to secure locations. She wrote detailed letters explaining everything, sealing them in envelopes to be opened only if something happened to her. She updated her will, transferred assets, and made arrangements that would only make sense later, and she bought the knife, a professional chef's blade from an expensive culinary store, paying in cash so there would be no credit card record. Why would a woman planning to divorce her husband need to purchase a weapon? The night of February 24th began like so many others in the deteriorating Kravtsov household. Dmitri came home at 11 p.m., having spent the evening with his latest conquest, and found Vera sitting at the kitchen table working on case files. He barely acknowledged her presence, helping himself to vodka from the freezer before heading to the bedroom. Vera waited, listening to the sounds of him moving through his evening routine. The shower running, the television turning on, the familiar pattern of a man who felt completely secure in his domain. At midnight, Dmitri's phone rang, and Vera could hear him speaking in low, intimate tones to whoever was on the other end. She heard him laugh, heard him make plans for the following day, heard him say things that once would have shattered her heart, but now barely registered. When the call ended, she heard the television go silent, heard the rustle of sheets as he settled into bed. She waited another hour, sitting motionless in the kitchen, staring at nothing. At 1 a.m., she retrieved the knife from where she had hidden it beneath the sink. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight, testing its balance. The security camera she had installed captured her standing there, and forensic psychologists would later analyze that footage frame by frame, trying to understand what was going through her mind. At 1:15, she walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, and the camera recorded her pause at the doorway, standing in the darkness for a full 3 minutes before proceeding. But she didn't go through with it then. She returned to the kitchen, placed the knife back under the sink, and sat down again. She stayed there until 2:30 in the morning, and then something happened that would become the most debated aspect of the entire case. Dmitri's phone, left charging on the kitchen counter, lit up with a message. Vera looked at it, and what she saw in that message changed everything. The message was from a woman named Irina, and it contained 2 attachments, photographs that revealed something far more sinister than simple infidelity. The images showed Dmitri with 2 underage girls, clearly intoxicated or drugged, in compromising positions at what appeared to be a private party. The message read, "Last night was incredible. Same time next week? The new girls you promised will be there?" Vera stared at those photographs for what the camera timestamp showed was 12 minutes, her expression unreadable. Whatever she had suspected, whatever evidence she had gathered about Dmitri's affairs and financial crimes, this was something she had never imagined. The man she had married wasn't just unfaithful and corrupt. He was a predator. In that moment, something crystallized in Vera's mind. This wasn't about revenge for her broken heart or justice for his betrayals. This was about stopping someone dangerous, someone who would continue to hurt vulnerable people if she didn't act. Or was it? This is where the case becomes complicated, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurs in ways that would challenge legal and moral frameworks. Because what Vera did next would spark debates about vigilante justice, about whether trauma justifies violence, about the limits of self-defense and the definition of murder. She picked up the knife again at 2:45 a.m., and this time, when she walked toward the bedroom, there was no hesitation. The details of what happened in those 11 minutes were reconstructed from multiple sources: the security footage that captured audio from the bedroom, the forensic evidence collected at the scene, and eventually from Vera's own testimony. Dmitri woke as she entered the room, groggy and confused. The cameras picked up his voice asking what she was doing. The sleepiness quickly replaced by alarm as he registered the knife in her hand. There was a struggle, evident from the disarray found later. Overturned furniture, torn bedding. Defensive wounds on Dmitri's hands and arms. He was a large man, significantly stronger than Vera, but she had the advantage of surprise and, as she would later explain, the strength that comes from absolute clarity of purpose. The forensic pathologist would count 17 stab wounds, a number that prosecutors would use to argue premeditation and excessive force, evidence of rage rather than self-defense. But Vera's attorney would counter that Dmitri had attacked her first, that several of her own injuries, bruises, scratches, a split lip, proved she had been fighting for her life. The truth, as often happens in such cases, was more complex than either narrative suggested. The security audio captured Vera's voice, calm and steady, telling Dmitri exactly why she was doing this. She told him about the photographs, about the girls, about how she couldn't let him continue. She told him she had sent everything to the authorities, that his crimes would be exposed whether she survived this night or not. And then came the moment that would be played repeatedly in courtrooms and on news programs across Russia. Dmitri's final words, captured clearly on the recording: "You're going to prison for this, you crazy bitch." And Vera's response, equally clear: "I know, but you won't hurt anyone else." The killing wasn't quick or clean. It was brutal and prolonged. And when it was over, Vera dropped the knife, called the police, and sat down on the blood-soaked floor to wait for them to arrive. The investigation that followed would reveal layers of complexity that transformed the case from a straightforward murder into something that captured international attention. When police arrived at the scene, they found Vera sitting calmly in the living room, her clothes covered in blood, making no attempt to flee or resist arrest. She provided a detailed statement, explaining everything methodically: the years of abuse, the evidence she had gathered, and most importantly, the photographs she had discovered that night. She gave investigators the locations of all her hidden evidence, the encrypted drives, the backup files, everything. But here's where the case took an unexpected turn. When police examined Dmitri's phone, the message Vera claimed to have seen wasn't there. The phone records showed no message from anyone named Irina at the time Vera specified. The photographs she described didn't exist on his device. Forensic specialists found evidence that the phone had been compromised, that files had been deleted, and the device had been wiped remotely shortly after the murder. Prosecutors immediately seized on this as proof that Vera had fabricated the entire story, that she had murdered her husband in cold blood and created an elaborate justification after the fact. They argued that a trained psychologist would know exactly what kind of narrative would generate public sympathy, that Vera had manipulated evidence and manufactured a defense. But then investigators began digging into Dmitri's background, and what they found complicated the prosecution's clean narrative of a deranged wife killing her innocent husband. Dmitri Volkov's life began to unravel in the investigation's bright light. The pharmaceutical scandal at Novamed went deeper than anyone had initially suspected, with evidence emerging of systematic fraud involving millions of dollars and connections to organized crime that reached the highest levels of Russian business and government. Several of Dmitri's associates were arrested on charges ranging from money laundering to racketeering. More disturbingly, investigators discovered that Dmitri had been the subject of 2 previous police reports, both involving inappropriate conduct with young women, both mysteriously buried without charges being filed. One report came from a 19-year-old intern at his company who claimed Dmitri had drugged and assaulted her at a business dinner. She later recanted her statement after receiving a substantial financial settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. The second report came from a hotel employee who witnessed Dmitri with 2 girls who appeared underage. That investigation was closed after the employee was fired and left Moscow under circumstances that suggested coercion. Friends and colleagues began coming forward with stories they had kept quiet for years, painting a picture of a man who used his charm, wealth, and connections to exploit vulnerable people while maintaining a pristine public image. Several women spoke about affairs that had gone beyond infidelity into realms of manipulation and control, describing patterns of behavior that matched psychological profiles of narcissistic predators. But none of this proved that the specific photographs Vera described had existed, and without that evidence, her claim of discovering them the night of the murder remained just that, a claim. The trial of Vera Kravtsova became a media sensation that dominated Russian headlines for 8 months. Public opinion was sharply divided, with some viewing Vera as a victim who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by years of abuse and the discovery of her husband's crimes, while others saw her as a cold-blooded murderer who had executed an elaborate plan to kill her husband and avoid consequences. The prosecution built their case on the physical evidence, the premeditated purchase of the knife, the lack of imminent threat that would justify lethal self-defense, the 17 stab wounds that suggested rage-driven overkill. They brought in forensic psychologists who testified that Vera's years of recording and documenting her husband's behavior indicated obsessive planning rather than self-protection. They emphasized that she had never attempted to leave the marriage, never sought a restraining order, never reported the abuse to authorities before taking matters into her own hands. The prosecution painted her as a woman who had decided she was above the law, who had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. They argued that her psychological training had allowed her to manipulate evidence and create a compelling narrative, that her entire defense was a carefully constructed performance. But the defense told a different story, one that resonated with many who had followed the case. They presented Vera as a victim of long-term domestic abuse, trapped in a relationship with a powerful man who had systematically destroyed her sense of self and her ability to escape. They brought in experts on coercive control who explained how psychological abuse could be more damaging than physical violence, how gaslighting could distort a victim's perception of reality and available options. The defense strategy centered on presenting all the evidence Vera had collected over the years, transforming the trial into an exposure of Dmitri Volkov's crimes and character. Hour after hour, the jury watched recordings of Dmitri berating Vera, calling her worthless, stupid, and crazy. They saw footage of him bringing other women into the marital home, heard conversations where he laughed about his wife with his friends, describing her as pathetic and easy to control. They reviewed financial documents showing his involvement in criminal enterprises, evidence that he had been under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. The defense brought forth witnesses who testified about Dmitri's reputation for exploiting young women, about rumors that had circulated in business circles for years regarding his predatory behavior. They presented testimony from Vera's sister, Elena, who described how Dmitri had systematically isolated Vera from her family, creating conflicts and spreading lies until the sisters barely spoke. They called Vera's therapist to testify about the psychological damage she had suffered, about the symptoms of complex PTSD and trauma bonding that had kept her trapped in the marriage. And they emphasized that even if the specific photographs Vera claimed to have seen couldn't be verified, the pattern of Dmitri's behavior made her belief in their existence entirely credible. The defense argued that when Vera saw that message, whatever it actually contained, it represented the final straw after years of accumulated trauma, triggering a psychological break that made her actions understandable, if not legally justified. But the most compelling and controversial aspect of the trial came when Vera herself took the stand. For 3 days, she testified in exhaustive detail about her marriage, her motivations, and the events of that fatal night. She was remarkably composed, speaking in the same calm, analytical tone she used with her therapy clients, which both helped and hurt her case. Some found her composure evidence of her innocence and psychological resilience. Others saw it as proof of her calculated nature and lack of genuine remorse. She acknowledged that she had purchased the knife with the possibility of using it against Dmitri, but claimed she hadn't made a final decision until seeing the message that night. She admitted that she couldn't prove the photographs had existed, that she had no way to verify what she had seen because the evidence had been destroyed. When asked if she regretted killing her husband, her answer became one of the most quoted moments of the trial. "I regret that I lived in fear for so long. I regret that I didn't trust myself or my perceptions. I regret that there was no other way to stop him. But do I regret that Dmitri Volkov can never hurt anyone again? No, I don't regret that." The honesty of that statement was both damning and sympathetic, revealing a woman who had moved beyond conventional moral frameworks into a space where she had calculated the value of her husband's life against the harm he might cause, and found him wanting. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor tried to paint her as a liar and manipulator, but Vera remained unshakable, answering every question with clinical precision. The turning point in the trial came from an unexpected source. A woman named Katerina Sokolova, who had been following the case through media coverage, came forward with information that would change everything. Katerina had worked as a housekeeper at an estate where Dmitri had attended parties, and she testified that she had witnessed events similar to what Vera described: wealthy men with young girls in compromising situations, drugs and alcohol flowing freely. An atmosphere of exploitation that she had found deeply disturbing, but had been too frightened to report. She couldn't testify specifically about Dmitri's involvement with underage girls, but her testimony corroborated that such activities occurred in his social circle. More importantly, Katerina brought with her a burner phone that had belonged to one of Dmitri's associates, which she had found discarded at the estate. Forensic analysis of that phone revealed messages discussing parties and fresh talent in language that strongly suggested human trafficking. Several of the conversations included Dmitri's name and phone number, placing him within a network that police had been investigating for months without knowing his involvement. While this evidence didn't directly prove that Vera had seen the specific photographs she claimed, it established that Dmitri had indeed been involved in exactly the kinds of activities she described. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the media. Suddenly, Vera's story seemed not just plausible but likely. Public sentiment, which had been divided, began shifting heavily in her favor as people grappled with the possibility that she had exposed a predatory network that might have continued operating if she hadn't acted. The jury deliberated for 6 days, a length of time that reflected the complexity of the case and the conflicting evidence they needed to reconcile. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with media, supporters from both sides, and observers who had become invested in the outcome. The verdict was guilty of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, a compromise that acknowledged both that Vera had killed her husband and that the circumstances had made her actions understandable, if not legally justified. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison, a relatively lenient sentence given the severity of the crime, but one that recognized the extraordinary circumstances of the case. In her statement before sentencing, Vera addressed the court one final time, and her words would be remembered long after the trial ended. She spoke about the invisible nature of psychological abuse, about how victims are trapped not by physical chains, but by manipulation and fear. She talked about the failure of systems designed to protect people from predators like Dmitri, about how wealth and connections can shield criminals from consequences until someone desperate enough decides to impose those consequences themselves. She acknowledged that what she did was illegal, that she had taken a life and would accept her punishment, but she maintained that she had also saved lives by stopping someone who would have continued to harm others. She addressed other victims of abuse directly, telling them that there were better options than the path she had chosen, that seeking help wasn't weakness, but courage. And then she said something that crystallized the moral ambiguity at the heart of her case. The law says what I did was murder. My conscience says it was survival. History will decide which verdict is correct. The aftermath of the Vera Kravtsova case rippled far beyond the courtroom walls. The investigation into Dmitri's associates led to multiple arrests and the exposure of a trafficking network that had operated for years, exploiting vulnerable women and girls while protected by money and power. Novamed Pharmaceuticals collapsed under the weight of the fraud scandal, with executives facing criminal charges and the company declaring bankruptcy. Several high-profile figures in Russian business and politics were implicated in various aspects of Dmitri's criminal enterprises, leading to resignations and further investigations. The case sparked national conversations about domestic abuse, psychological trauma, and the limits of self-defense laws, with advocacy groups using Vera's story to push for legal reforms that would better recognize coercive control as a form of violence. Mental health professionals debated whether Vera's psychological training had given her unique tools to survive an abusive marriage or had prevented her from seeking help because she believed she should be able to handle it herself. The media remained fascinated with every aspect of the case, producing countless articles, documentaries, and analysis pieces that explored different angles of the story. Some portrayed Vera as a hero who had risked everything to stop a monster, while others maintained she was a killer who had circumvented the justice system to commit premeditated murder. The truth, as is often the case, probably lay somewhere between these extremes, in the complicated space where victimhood and agency intersect, where trauma and choice blur together in ways that simple narratives can't capture. Inside prison, Vera became something of a legend among the inmates, many of whom were themselves survivors of domestic violence and abuse. She established informal therapy groups, using her professional skills to help other women process their trauma and develop coping strategies for life behind bars. She maintained her composure and dignity, refusing interviews and media attention despite constant requests. Her case became a touchstone for discussions about justice, not just legal justice, but moral justice, the kind that exists in the messy realm of human experience where right and wrong aren't always clearly delineated. Appeals filed by her legal team argued for a reduced sentence based on new evidence about Dmitri's crimes, and several human rights organizations supported her case, arguing that she had been punished for defending herself against a predator that the system had failed to stop. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of Russians believed her sentence was too harsh, that she deserved clemency given the circumstances. Some legal scholars argued that her case revealed fundamental problems with how the justice system handles domestic abuse cases, pointing out that women are often forced to choose between enduring ongoing victimization or taking drastic action that leads to their own imprisonment. Others maintained that whatever Dmitri's crimes, Vera's response was disproportionate and illegal, that accepting her actions as justified would set a dangerous precedent for vigilante violence. The debate showed no signs of resolving, with the Vera Kravtsova case becoming a litmus test for people's beliefs about justice, morality, gender, power, and the social contract. As the years passed and Vera served her sentence, new information continued to emerge that added layers to an already complex story. Several women came forward to share their experiences with Dmitri, adding to the portrait of him as a serial predator whose behavior had been enabled by social structures that privileged powerful men over their victims. Some of these women expressed gratitude to Vera, saying that her actions had saved them from further abuse. Others struggled with conflicting feelings, acknowledging that while Dmitri had harmed them, they couldn't condone murder as a solution. The conversations around the case evolved as the Me Too movement gained global momentum, with Vera's story becoming part of larger discussions about how societies respond to gendered violence and who gets believed when accusations are made. Some feminists embraced Vera as a symbol of women fighting back against patriarchal oppression, while others worried that celebrating her actions could reinforce stereotypes about women being emotional and irrational. Legal experts continued to debate whether existing self-defense laws adequately protected people experiencing coercive control and psychological abuse, or whether new frameworks were needed that recognized the cumulative effect of trauma on decision-making and perceived options for escape. The case raised questions that went beyond Vera and Dmitri specifically, touching on fundamental issues about how we define violence, who we consider victims, and what kinds of responses we deem acceptable when formal systems of justice fail. The question of whether Vera Kravtsova was a murderer or a victim defending herself and others may never be definitively answered, because it depends on frameworks of understanding that vary between individuals and cultures. What is clear is that her case revealed uncomfortable truths about the systems meant to protect people from harm. How those systems often fail, how wealth and power can shield predators, how victims are frequently disbelieved or ignored until something catastrophic happens. It showed how psychological abuse can be invisible to outsiders while being devastating to those experiencing it, how trauma can accumulate over years until a person reaches a breaking point that seems sudden only to those who haven't been paying attention. It demonstrated the incredible burden placed on victims to gather evidence, to prove their abuse, to justify their fear, while perpetrators are often given the benefit of the doubt until the proof is overwhelming. And it forced uncomfortable conversations about the nature of justice itself, whether the legal definition of justice always aligns with moral justice, whether punishing someone who killed a predator serves society's interests or simply reinforces the status quo that allowed the predator to operate freely in the first place. The Vera Kravtsova case became more than a story about one woman killing her husband. It became a mirror reflecting back society's values, assumptions, and failures in protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. So where does this leave us with Vera's story? She remains in prison, serving her sentence with the same calm composure that characterized her throughout the trial. She has become an advocate for other incarcerated women, particularly those who ended up behind bars after defending themselves from abusers. She continues to maintain that while she regrets the necessity of what she did, she doesn't regret stopping Dmitri from hurting anyone else. The evidence that has emerged since the trial has vindicated many of her claims about her husband's character and criminal activities, though the specific trigger for that final night, those photographs she claimed to have seen, remains unverified. Supporters continue to campaign for her release, arguing that she has served enough time for a crime committed under extraordinary duress. Critics maintain that accepting her actions would undermine the rule of law and the principle that individuals can't take justice into their own hands. The debate continues, as passionate and divided as ever. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Vera Kravtsova case isn't the verdict or the sentence or even the exposure of Dmitri's crimes. Perhaps it's the conversations the case started, the awareness it raised about psychological abuse and coercive control, the way it forced people to grapple with complexity rather than accepting simple narratives about victims and perpetrators. The case challenges us to think deeply about justice, about trauma, about the social structures that enable harm, and about what we owe to those who have been failed by the systems designed to protect them. It reminds us that truth is often more complicated than we want it to be, that people can be simultaneously victims and agents, that understanding doesn't require approval, but it does require empathy. If you've made it this far in Vera's story, you've engaged with these difficult questions, and that engagement itself matters. The case of Vera Kravtsova doesn't offer easy answers, but it demands that we keep asking the questions. What would you have done in her situation? Where is the line between self-defense and murder? Who deserves protection and who deserves punishment? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're real issues that affect real people every day. And maybe by wrestling with them through Vera's story, we can build a world where fewer people face the impossible choices she confronted that February night. If this story has made you think, made you question your assumptions, or made you want to learn more about domestic abuse and coercive control, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to stay informed about cases like this that challenge our understanding of justice. Like this video if you believe these conversations matter and need to continue. Because stories like Vera's only create change when people engage with them, discuss them, and use them to push for better systems of protection and justice for everyone.